Okay, so I saw that you guys really seem to enjoy me talking about ideas for Marvel Rivals characters. So, since I did have a few more ideas, I decided to make a few more videos. Naturally, we're going to start with the Vanguard role because, as I said last time, it is my personal favorite. There's also the fact that I started with it last time, so we maintain a little bit of consistency, I guess you could say there. Now, I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's just hop right on into the list. Alright, so we're actually starting off with the first name on the list alphabetically, Absorbing Man. I'm not going alphabetically through the rest of this, that's kind of just a coincidence. Naturally, he'd wield his typical weapon, the ball and chain. This would be his primary as well. He'd swing the ball and chain around from left to right for his primary. He would have an added cooldown, which would let him extend the ball and chain outwards. This would be able to go relatively far, and when it hits an enemy, it would crush them into the ground. Sort of like the effect when Wolverine lands after grabbing somebody, so the person that it crushes would be down flat on their back. The ball and chain would also be able to pull someone towards Absorbing Man after that while they're on the ground. It wouldn't pull them right up in front of him unless the person he hits with it was already very close to him. It wouldn't pull an enemy a super long distance, essentially, is what I'm saying. So if you hit someone who's kind of far away with it, it wouldn't really pull them up right in front of you. It could still be useful for displacing enemies, though, and even just temporarily removing someone from the equation because of the stun. Now, you might be wondering how I'm going to factor in his absorbing, considering that's a pretty big part of his power set. For this, I'm actually going to be pulling a bit from the game Marvel Contest of Champions. So, Absorbing Man would have multiple different states that he could enter. His base state would be his simple human form. In this form, he's pretty much just a normal dude. Doesn't gain any additional abilities or anything like that, aside from having the chain extension I already talked about. He would have two other cooldowns which would activate his other states. The states would last somewhere between 15 to 20 seconds and then go and cool down for a bit. Sort of like how Emma's diamond form works, except you'd be staying in the forms a bit longer than Emma stays in her diamond form. His first added form would be a sort of magma lava form. In this form, he'd gain additional offensive capabilities. He'd keep his primary and his chain extension cooldown, but they'd both deal added base damage and burst damage. The base damage is pretty simple. The attack would simply deal a bit more damage. Not an insane uptick or anything, just enough to make it noticeable. Then for the burst damage, think of it how Gambit's burst works. There's the initial hit, then a little bit more damage afterwards. In this form, he'd gain two additional cooldowns. Think of it like how Gambit's different card decks work. You pick one, and then once you do, the inputs to select the two decks are replaced by new cooldowns. His first cooldown would be an extension of the ball and chain, like his already established cooldown, but this one would knock people back. This could be used to push someone off the map, or it could be used to knock them into a wall. Knocking them into the wall would cause them to take extra damage. This attack would also afflict them with the extra burst damage I already said he had with his other attacks in his molten form. His second cooldown would have him dash forward himself instead of extending the chain. He could slam into somebody, knocking them backwards like the other cooldown. This one would be more damaging on the initial hit, but hitting them into a wall wouldn't deal added damage. It'd also keep the added burst damage all the other attacks in this state have. The second state he could have would be Vibranium. This one would be a more defensive state. Of course, he'd keep his base attack and chain extension cooldown, but instead of dealing burst damage to whoever they hit, in this state, they deal slight damage reduction. Basically, what this means is that the person he hits with this would be dealing slightly less damage. Not a huge amount, just enough that it's noticeable, and it wouldn't last egregiously long, maybe like 4 or 5 seconds, something like that. His first cooldown in this state would have him spinning around his ball and chain. Any enemies hit by this would be afflicted with the same damage reduction his other attacks get in this state, having their own damage slightly reduced. They'd also be knocked away from him, not a long distance though. Along with this, any allies he hit would get temporary shields, reducing any damage afflicted to them for a short period of time. His second cooldown in this state would be more focused on boosting the team up. He'd extend shields to allies near him. These shields would hover around any teammates affected, kind of like the ones the Thing gives allies he jumps to. These would give damage reduction to the allies, like how the Thing's shields works, not his other damage reduction. Since they're Vibranium though, they'd absorb some of the damage taken, and after a bit they'd explode, damaging any enemies caught nearby. For his ultimate, he'd unlock his final state, Uru Metal. In this state, he'd have two abilities that he can use, but he can only use one, and using it would immediately end his ultimate. The first of these cooldowns would be a more offensive one. His ball and chain would become massive and he'd throw them up into the air. they'd come flying back down to the earth, damaging any enemies caught in the radius. They'd also deal the burst damage associated with his lava form. His second cooldown would be the more defensive one. This would work a bit like Gambit's ult. Any allies within his radius would be afflicted by it, like how Gambit's works. This one, however, would take the lower damage from the Vibranium, so allies hit by it would take lower damage. Along with that, they'd get temporary Vibranium shields, which would explode and deal damage to enemies. This is quite similar to his second cooldown in the Vibranium state, so it'd last longer than those shields, as well as being able to absorb more damage, and thus deal more damage when it explodes. It'd also affect any enemies nearby, causing them to deal less damage for a longer period as well. This ultimate would also give him the buffs his teammates are given, unlike his cooldown, which only helps his teammates. So that's my pitch for an Absorbing Man kit. I think it's pretty fun, but we're not even close to done yet. We've still got 9 more, so let's try to bang these things out. Alright, so next up on this list is Odin. Somebody recommended him in the comments of the first video, and I thought he could definitely be an interesting inclusion, so I wanted to talk about him. So Odin is an incredibly powerful character, and he has a lot of different powers that he can use. So there were a lot of different things to look at and try to figure out how to incorporate them into a potential kit. To begin, for his primary, he'd use his spear, called Gungnir, I think is how it's pronounced. He would jab the spear directly forward, sort of like what Angela does with her spear when she's flying. However, he'd also have what is essentially a secondary fire, where he'd be able to throw the spear, and after he throws it, whether or not it connects with an enemy, it'd return right back to his hand. For his cooldowns, I don't have nearly as much for him as I did for Absorbing Man, but I do have some stuff, alright? First of all, he'd be able to grant allies temporary invulnerability. This wouldn't last absurdly long, and it'd work in a similar way to Magneto's bubble. Unlike Mag's bubble, though, enemies wouldn't be able to break this. It'd just last for a certain frame of time, then end. Also, Odin wouldn't be able to give this invulnerability to himself, only to his teammates. He'd have another cooldown focusing on his energy projection. This would send out a horizontal wave of energy directly in front of him. The wave would expand outwards as it moved, but the further it moved and expanded, the less damage it'd deal to anyone it hit. It wouldn't stop after hitting a single enemy, it'd just continue moving until it hit a wall or just flew off screen. Along with damaging enemies, it'd also apply a slowing effect to anyone it hit. The amount it slowed down an enemy wouldn't decrease as the wave moved, but the length of time an enemy was slowed for would decrease. His ultimate would pull on the invulnerability he can give to his allies. He'd let off a massive blast which would give himself, along with any allies caught in it, the invulnerability shield his cooldown gives out. This one would last a little longer though. It'd also affect any enemies caught in it with the slowing effect from his projectile. My third pick for this list is Fin Fang Foom. I mean, I looked at the character roster and there's no characters whose name starts with the letter F, so we gotta get somebody in there, am I right? He's obviously massive and would need to be scaled down significantly to work in this game. I'm pretty sure he's able to change his size in the comics, so you can just say he's doing that. That being said, I would want him to be the largest of the characters on the roster. Also, I think he should walk around on 4 legs. Foom's primary would be his acid mist that he breathes out of his mouth. This would fire straight forward out of his mouth, and it'd function sort of like how Jeff's beam works, so it'd just fire continuously until he needs to reload it. Unlike Jeff's beam though, this wouldn't heal his allies, it'd only damage his enemies. It also wouldn't be as thin of a beam, it'd be a bit wider, but it wouldn't travel all the way across the map like Jeff's can, although it would have a decent range. Foom would also be able to fly, but only for short periods, sort of like Doctor Strange. While flying, he could use his primary, but that's about it. Foom would have a cooldown where he uses one of his wings as a barrier. He'd hold up the wing and it'd protect himself as well as any allies standing behind it. The barrier would be a bit longer than his body to better protect more people. I think of it sort of like Reinhardt's shield from Overwatch, but it wouldn't have as much health and allies wouldn't be able to shoot through it. In the comics, Foom has the ability to control reptiles to some extent. So Foom would have a cooldown where he can summon a small lizard. This lizard could be aimed towards either an ally or an enemy. If aimed at an ally, it'd move to them and take a hit for them. If aimed at an enemy, it'd move to them and drain a small portion of their health. The health the reptile drained from the enemy would then be given back to Foom. Foom's final cooldown would be a brief stun of sorts. In the comics, he has this ability where he can sort of shoot a beam from his eyes which physically morphs anything it hits into something else. So he'd aim at an enemy and turn them into a version of themselves who had no weapons or anything like that. So when an enemy is hit by this beam, they can't do anything but run and jump for a short period of time. They can't attack, not even with their melee. All they can do is try to run away. However, they wouldn't be totally stunned out of moving. For his ultimate, Foom would grow to a much larger state. In this state, all you'd be able to do is wildly swing your forearms when playing as him. Hitting enemies would knock them back and damage them, and if you walk into an enemy, you'll knock them back slightly. The main purpose of this would basically just be disruption, although you could absolutely get some decent damage out of it if you knew what you were doing. Next up, we've got a Spider-Man villain, Scorpion. Spider-Man has a lot of interesting villains, a few of whom I've already discussed in other videos, but there's definitely a few more who I think could fit into Rivals nicely. So, with Scorpion, his primary is actually going to be a ranged attack. He's going to be shooting a poisonous blast out of the tip of his tail directly forwards. His secondary fire is going to be slamming his tail on the ground. This attack would come out really fast. It'd do a little bit of damage in a circular radius around where the tail impacts with the ground, but it'd deal a much more significant amount of damage if it hits somebody directly. He'd have a cooldown where he could coil his tail up, then essentially use it as a spring, flinging himself in whatever direction you're aiming in. You could aim straight forward if you wanted, or aim it up to get to higher ground, or to reach an enemy in the air, whatever you want. He would have another cooldown with his tail that would allow him to quickly stretch it forward. This would stun an enemy for a temporary period of time. It wouldn't be able to stun things like an ulting Luna or a charging Thing, though. This could be used in combination with his spring cooldown to stun flyers out of the air, or just used on whoever you want, it doesn't really matter. His third and final cooldown would have him using a cloud of poison gas. If you've ever played Apex Legends, I kind of think of this like Caustic's gas grenade from that game, except you'd be firing it out of your tail as Scorpion instead of throwing it. You would be able to aim it though, you wouldn't just fire it out like Punisher with his smoke, so you'd be able to use it a bit more strategically. It wouldn't do an absurd amount of damage, but the damage it dealt would slowly pick up over time if an enemy remained inside it for too long. Scorpion would be the only one able to see inside the poison gas, unless there was a Scorpion on the other team. The field of the gas wouldn't be too big, but it'd be big enough that there'd be space to move around in, so you could go in there and maybe pick somebody off, since they wouldn't be able to see you unless you were directly in front of them. For his ultimate, I want to implement the sort of hypnotization that he uses in Spider-Man PS4. My idea for this is that he'd shoot out a blast directly in front of him, and any enemies caught by it would be afflicted by his hypnotism. When hypnotized, their vision would be messed up in some way. I think maybe you can mess up the screen, like have the screen where the enemies see sort of tilt and slide a little bit, so it'd give the effect of their character being nauseous and make it a bit harder to play. This wouldn't be the most broken ultimate in the game, and some people could probably get around it, but some people would probably be affected by it even after they dealt with it multiple times. My next pick is Cannonball. Shockingly, we're 5 spots in, and only now am I getting to my first mutant character. If you guys have seen my other videos talking about potential Rivals characters, you know I love my mutants, so that actually is a pretty big deal. Alright, so for Sam's primary, he's going to shoot off these biokinetic blasts from his hands. So with Sam's power, for those of you who don't know, his body basically creates this energy and releases it from his skin. This is how he does the constant blasting around, because the energy can be used to propel him, but in some forms it can also be used for energy blasts, so that's going to be his primary. He's going to sort of lob the blasts in an upward arc, and then they'll descend back down quickly to hit enemies in front of him. Having them be lobbed up would allow him a level of anti-air play though. Now for his cooldowns. The main one would be his blasting. Sam would have 3 blasts on cooldown, which would allow him to go into his cannonball state for short periods of time. His cannonball state would be a controlled state, sort of like Angela's flight, but he'd only be able to remain in it for short bursts. He couldn't stay in it at all times like Angela. In his flight, he'd gain momentum, which would slowly increase his flight speed. However, if you stop at all, whether that be because you chose to, because your cannonball state ended, or because you were stunned, you'd immediately lose all your momentum. So you would want to try to be constantly moving in this state, because building up more momentum would lead to more damage and more speed. The 2 cooldowns he'd have, only available in his cannonball state, would both be related to damage dealing. One would be a punch. You could activate this at any point in your cannonball state if you wanted to, but the more momentum you've built up, the more damage it'd do. It'd just be a simple punch with a little bit of knockback on it. His second cooldown in this state would be a grab. I think of it sort of like a mix between Angela's and Emma's. For one, this grab would only be achievable at the maximum level of momentum, and even if you reach max level, if you stop, it all disappears, so you'd have to stay moving. However, if you do pull off the grab, you'd be grabbing an enemy, of course. You would carry the enemy for a little bit, sort of like Angela, before then being able to throw them in any direction you choose or drop them. If you don't throw them before the end of the throwing window, they'll just be dropped. Dropping them would just drop them right below you, whereas I said throwing them can throw them in any direction you want, and if you throw them at a wall, they'll take a little bit of damage from colliding with the wall. That's not it for Cannonball though, because he'd have another cooldown. This one would be usable both in his base state and in his Cannonball state. This would have you quickly blasting yourself at an ally to grant them bonus shield health. This health would go away slowly, sort of like how Venom's shield works. In your base form, you can only give this shield to one ally per use of the blast. However, in your Cannonball form, you'd be able to chain the movements together, so long as you don't stop. The more momentum you have, the longer you'd be able to carry it on, as using this in your Cannonball form would drain your momentum slowly. However, it would be entirely possible, as long as your teammates are grouped up relatively close together, to hit all of them with this and grant them all shield. In your base form, you'd only grant a teammate 100 extra shield health. However, in your Cannonball form, depending on how much momentum you've built up, you'd be able to give a teammate up to 500 shield health. Since your momentum would decline as you used it though, you'd be giving each teammate less and less extra health. Also, if you stop completely, you'd lose all your momentum, so you'd have to be thinking and reacting quickly while using this if you're trying to chain them together. Okay, his ultimate is probably the least interesting part of his kit, but it essentially puts you in a spruced up version of your Cannonball state for a brief period of time. Now, this would be slightly tweaked. Essentially, you'd have full momentum for the whole time. The one change is that you'd only be able to use the grab once in the ultimate state. Otherwise, you've got all the perks of full momentum. You can move around through the air at his full speed. You can chain shields together from ally to ally, although you'd only be able to hit an ally once with the shield. If they already have your shield, you can't hit them with it again until all the shield you already gave them has decayed. But you'd be able to fly around and spam the punch all you want, even if you stopped moving. So that's it for Cannonball. I'm not sure if that's a good kit. I'm not sure if any of these are, but it was at least fun to come up with and talk about. Okay guys, so I want to really quickly take a pause here in the video to talk about something not completely related to the topic. Basically, the majority of my viewers are not subscribed. Getting subs really helps a channel, especially a small one, to be able to continue making videos. So if you want to see more content from me, just drop a sub. It really helps more than you can know. I hate to pause the video to ask about this, but it really is important. Also, if you have any topics you'd like to see me discuss in a different video, Rivals related or otherwise, drop them in the comments. All right, back to the list. Okay, detour complete. Let's get back to the list. I've got Miss Marvel. So this is a character that I think definitely has a good chance of getting included on the roster if this game lasts for long enough. She's a pretty popular legacy character, and she's been in the MCU, and she's going to be in Marvel Tokon Fighters. So what did I come up with for her kit? Well, since she's a tank, I wanted to work mostly with her size-changing stuff. However, there is one ability using her hard light construct stuff, which I think is mostly from the MCU, but I believe it's also been implemented into the comics in some capacity. So her primary would be sort of like Reed's punching primary, except instead of just extending her fist forward, she'd reach it out a bit and slam it on the ground. If she chained 3 melee attacks together, all immediately following each other, the third attack would have her extending her leg out in a sweeping motion. This would deal more damage than the previous 2 slams, and also have a little bit of knockback on it. As for her cooldowns, like I said, most of her abilities would be related to her size-changing powers, but I did decide to implement one use of her hard light powers. So Kamala would have a cooldown where she could use her hard light creating abilities to generate barriers for her allies. I wanted to try to differentiate these barriers from the ones that other characters already have, so you wouldn't be able to shoot through them, but they'd be pretty large, like the largest of the barriers in the game, so it'd be bigger than Strange's shield. But again, you wouldn't be able to shoot through it, so that'd present some complications. The barrier wouldn't be able to be moved after it's deployed, though, unless of course you're deploying another one after the cooldown is up, but that'd get rid of the first one, assuming it hasn't already been destroyed. As for her other cooldowns, these ones would in fact be tied into her size changing. For the first, she'd have a sort of lock-on to an ally or enemy, sort of like how the Thing does when he's going to jump to somebody. Instead of jumping at them, though, she'd grab them and pull them towards herself. Like I said, this could be used on an ally or an enemy. So you could pull an ally out of a tight spot or pull an enemy towards you to try to finish them off. After you pull someone in, before you release them, you'd have the ability to either throw them or squeeze them. Throwing them would have the same effect for either an ally or enemy. You just toss them in whatever direction you're facing. When squeezing them, the effect would be different depending on if it was an ally or enemy you were doing it to. When doing it to an enemy, they'd take some damage. Pretty simple. When doing it to an ally, they'd receive a slight burst of shield health, but this health wouldn't decay over time. Of course, if they lost that health from taking damage, they wouldn't be able to get it back through healing. Her final cooldown would have her extending her arms out and pulling herself. This wouldn't work like Moon Knight's grapple, where you can aim it at the ground and propel yourself upwards. You'd only be able to use it on areas higher than you to pull yourself up. For her ultimate, she'd make both of her fists massive and start running around, slamming them into the ground. I'm sort of thinking of it like Donkey Kong's down B from Super Smash Bros., if you're familiar with that. Not a whole lot going on there, if I'm honest. Alright, so next up I have Bishop. Now, Bishop is a character who can do a whole bunch of stuff and has a whole bunch of weapons, so I tried to make an interesting kit revolving around that. Before we touch on any of his abilities, even his primary fire, we need to talk about his passive. Bishop would have a gauge that goes from 0 to 100. This would account for his stored energy. Since Bishop's powers are basically all about absorbing energy, naturally as the gauge goes up, he'd become more powerful. However, to balance that out, Bishop would still take damage from stuff. I know that in the comics, the attacks he'd receive from energy wouldn't really be able to damage him, but I don't know that making it so quite a few characters just can't straight up damage another character on the roster would be very balanced. And to be fair, I'm not sure how balanced any of these kits are, but that's a line I don't really want to cross. Taking no damage from stuff, I just don't think that's totally fair. As a concession, though, any sort of energy attacks would deal reduced damage to Bishop. So things like Gambit's primary fire, since those are cards charged up with kinetic energy, or Phoenix's primary, would do reduced damage to him. It wouldn't reduce how much those attacks charge him up, though. Any damaging effect from an enemy would charge Bishop's gauge, but any melee attack would charge him up less than a projectile attack. Now, his gauge would charge up to 100. If you manage it properly, and once he reaches 100, he'd be supercharged. We'll talk more about this after running through the rest of what he can do. Alright, so for Bishop's primary, he'd have a pretty simple laser gun. This would be similar to Punisher's primary fire, except it wouldn't fire as fast and it'd do a bit more damage. The lasers he'd fire would also be a bit bigger. He'd have a secondary fire which would fire out plasma charges. These would travel pretty slowly, but they do more damage than his primary fire and would also slightly slow anyone hit by them. Of course, both of these abilities would become more powerful the more energy Bishop has saved up. Now for his cooldowns. Now, the way Bishop's cooldowns would work is that each of them would drain some of his energy gauge to use. So getting to 100 is a bit more difficult as you'll have to manage using your cooldowns and thus sacrificing gauge. Now, there's no limit to your gauge gain. You could sacrifice, say, 20 of your gauge for a cooldown and immediately gain that right back from taking damage, but that may not happen, so you have to manage things carefully. His first cooldown is pretty simple. It'd only take 15 gauge to use, and it'd just have him firing an energy blast straight forward out of both hands. Of course, the more gauge you have built up, the more damage this blast would do. The size and speed of the blast would also increase as the gauge does, meaning at 100 gauge, it would be an incredibly deadly attack. His second cooldown would require 30 gauge, and this would be his method of shielding allies. He would blast allies with his energy, and they'd gain a temporary shield, sort of like Magneto's bubble. Just like Magneto's bubble, if the shield takes too much damage, it'd disappear. And as you have more gauge, allies will gain more shields from you using this ability. His third cooldown would require 50 gauge, and this would fire out an explosive from his gun. This explosive would have a fairly wide range and do good damage, but it'd also take a lot of gauge, so you'd have to decide whether or not it was really worth using. Now, I said earlier I wasn't done talking about his gauge, and I wasn't. Bishop's gauge, after reaching 100, would supercharge him, like I said previously. His cooldowns would be slightly shortened. All his cooldowns would briefly be at full capacity, however, he would take damage over time in this state. This would start out relatively small, but it'd increase the longer you remained in this state. As well as that, your cooldowns would cost you the amount of health equal to the amount of gauge they would have cost you traditionally. So let's say you use the shield cooldown while supercharged. You'd immediately lose 30 HP. Now, you could still be healed while in this state, but eventually it'd reach a point where you're taking so much damage over time that you just drop dead, even if everyone else on your team was a healer, solely focused on healing you. So, how do you get out of this supercharged state? This is where a fourth cooldown would come in. Well supercharged, and only well supercharged, Bishop would be able to let off a massive blast of energy. This would immediately reset his gauge to 0. It's sort of like Strange's ability where he expends all his energy, but the blast field would be wider and more damaging to enemies. As for his ult, I wanted to incorporate time travel in some way since it's pretty intrinsic to Bishop's character. So, using his ult would revert you to the state you were in 3 seconds ago. Not just your health, but also your gauge and your cooldown timers. So, let's say you just used the bomb cooldown. Well, now after using your ult, you'd get it right back. This would be best paired with your supercharged state, since after expelling it or taking a lot of damage, you could just revert back to full health and full gauge. I think this character would have the potential to be quite good. I'm sure people will let me know in the comments if this kit is too broken or not. I think it's fun though. Anyways, on to the next character. Okay, next up I've got Dr. Octopus. I'm noticing as I'm doing this that a lot of the characters on this list have kits that involve in some way extending something out, whether that be a ball and chain, a tail, an arm, or in Doc Ock's case, a robotic tentacle. This isn't going to stop me from including him here though. I should say first that in my mind, Doc Ock would be walking around on his bottom two tentacles, like they'd be on the ground walking like legs and he'd be elevated, basically like in LEGO Marvel Superheroes. His primary would have him striking forward with both of his top two tentacles, the ones not on the ground. They'd strike down slightly so he could actually hit enemies, since his tentacles would have him pretty high up. He'd have another cooldown where he could leap, sort of like Hulk, and he'd be able to grab onto walls if he wanted to. He could wall crawl with his tentacles like how Venom or Spider-Man do. He'd also be able to use his tentacles to grab. They'd be able to extend a decent distance. After he grabs somebody, he'd just pull them in like how Bucky does, but there'd be no additional hit or throw or anything. It'd be up to you to decide how you want to finish the person you've pulled in off. He'd have another ability where his top two arms would reach down and pull large rocks out of the ground. From here, he'd be able to slam the two of them together. If he could catch someone between the two rocks when slamming them, it'd deal some pretty serious damage. He'd also be able to throw the rocks if he so chose. For his ultimate, he'd call in a bunch of little Octobots to roam around. These would either run up to an enemy and explode, damaging them, or run up to an ally and explode, granting them a slight damage boost for a short period of time. Yeah, if I'm being honest, this is one of the characters I had the least amount of stuff to talk about for, but I did want to put him on the list because I do think he'll probably get added eventually, and I would like to see him in there. And NetEase could probably come up with a way cooler kit for this guy than I did here. Alright, so next up is one of the characters I'd say I probably saw recommended the most in the comments of the last video. We've got Sabretooth. I think I did mention him as an honorable mention in that video, but he's the only honorable mention from that video to get promoted to an actual spot on the list this time, so good for him. Okay, so for Sabretooth, I'm definitely envisioning him playing somewhat similar to Wolverine. Obviously, he'd be bigger than Logan, though. He'd also be outputting a bit more damage. His primary would be simply swiping his claws forward. Unlike Logan, he wouldn't have a meter that builds up as he lands hits, though. He'd have his claw swipes, and that's about it for his primary. I'd want to plan Sabretooth being sort of animalistic and like a hunter, so he'd have a cooldown where he could perform a pretty simple slash in front of him. However, the trick with this slash is that now the person he'd slashed would have a red outline on them that Sabretooth would be able to see, no matter where they went. If they go behind a wall, you would still be able to see their outline. If they walk to the complete other side of the map, you'd still be able to see their outline. Even if they went invisible, you'd be able to see the outline. The only way to get rid of the outline would be for either Sabretooth or the enemy he'd marked to die. So as the marked enemy, if you or an ally kill Sabretooth, you're no longer marked. But if you can't get rid of him, you'll be marked until you die. Even if you go into spawn and switch characters, you'd still be marked. The only way to get rid of the mark is for you or Sabretooth to die. Now, as for his other cooldowns, Sabretooth would really be the ultimate tracker in a sense. A lot of his kit would revolve around being a damage sponge and also around choosing targets to track, hunting them down, and then moving on to another target. He'd have another cooldown where he can sort of rush forward on all fours. If you press the button again right at the end of the charge, Sabretooth would leap forward. If you don't connect with anybody, that leap would just end in a roll on the ground, which would put you back to your normal walking state at the end. If you do connect with someone, specifically an enemy, you'd grab onto them and bite them, damaging them before releasing them. However, this bite would inflict bleed to an enemy, dealing a little bit of damage over time for a short period. Sabretooth would also be able to scale walls, just like Spider-Man or Venom. He'd be able to leap off of walls, and he could do a similar grab to the one involved with his run, where he would grab someone and bite them, dealing not only some damage, but also inflicting a short amount of damage over time. This would likely be mapped to the same button as the charge, but could only be used when leaping off of a wall. I have one last cooldown for him, which is just a forward slash. He'd slash forward with both of his arms, the slash forming a sort of X shape. Hitting a normal enemy with this would inflict them with the same bleed debuff as most of his other cooldowns and would deal a little bit of damage, nothing too special there. However, if you hit a marked enemy with this, it'd deal significantly more damage along with inflicting them with a more significant bleed debuff. Activating Sabretooth's ultimate would just mark everyone on the enemy team who was alive when he used it. So if there's somebody waiting to respawn on the enemy team when Sabretooth pops his ult, they wouldn't be affected even when they respawned. This marking would only last for the duration of the ultimate though. It would go away. It's not like the other one where Sabretooth or the player marked have to die to get rid of it. This ability would just make Sabretooth significantly more potent as a hunter for a brief period of time. Okay, we're moving on to the last spot of this list, and I actually don't have honorable mentions this time, but as a consolation for that, I'll probably be making a third tank video at some point. Anyways, the final spot on this list is given to Sentry. Now, this is a character who has a lot of powers, and a lot of them are pretty broken, so I tried to fit in what I could. A lot of his abilities here are going to be based around his photokinesis and energy projection stuff. So his primary attack is going to be a simple forward blast of light. This would be a straight blasting beam and would likely be pretty fast. He'd be able to shoot them out pretty fast so they wouldn't do an absurd amount of damage. Sentry's first cooldown would allow him to go invisible. This isn't a super special cooldown, it'd work more like Psylocke's invisibility than Inviz's, as it only lasts for a short period of time. Obviously, if you use any sort of attacks or any cooldowns, your invisibility ends. Now, we're finally getting back to tanks who have cooldowns to actively protect the team. Sentries would come in the form of briefly granting allies invulnerability. He'd shoot a blast out and any ally caught in it would gain invulnerability for a short burst. This would of course mean they take no damage for a bit. You can maybe tweak this so instead the damage they take is just reduced, but like if this actually came to the game and the invulnerability was too broken, I'm sure they'd just go ahead and make that change. Sentry would also have a forward dash ability. This would allow him to dash in whatever direction he was looking extremely quickly. Like it'd practically be a teleport, but it'd damage any enemies between where he was dashing from and where he dashed to. He could also use this to dash upwards, and he would have slow fall in the air like Magneto and a few other characters do. He'd have another cooldown where he'd just fire a much larger light beam. This would essentially just have the effect of being a more damaging attack he could use. There isn't a whole lot going on there. Sentry's passive would be healing. This would take effect only after Sentry has stopped taking damage for 4 seconds. The healing would only restore the amount of health you currently have, obviously capping off at his full health. So let's say you have 200 health left, then the healing would only heal you up to 400 health and then it'd stop. The healing would only be reactivated after you've taken some damage, then once again stopped after taking damage for 4 seconds. Sentry's ultimate would, as I'm sure many of you could assume, call on the Void. This ultimate would sort of have multiple stages, so let me explain. The first part would be when he activates the ultimate. This would be sort of like Wanda's ultimate where she's totally vulnerable and able to be cancelled out by pretty much anything. You could just kill him in this state and stop the ultimate from activating, or you could stun him out of it. Let's say though that Sentry gets through this phase with the ultimate. He would release a large blast of darkness. This darkness would coat a wide area around him. This would change the terrain, basically just making whatever area you're in completely black. The shapes of buildings and stuff like that would remain the same, assuming they aren't destructible. They just become completely black. The blast of darkness would also damage enemies, but it wouldn't be instant kill like Wanda's ult. The damage would be solid, but wouldn't be enough to insta-kill anyone at full health. That's because the ultimate wouldn't end there though. The black voided terrain would damage enemies who stood on it. It wouldn't be a significant amount of damage, but it'd be enough that it was noticeable. The voided terrain would slowly disappear from its edges back to the center of the original blast, so everything hit by it would slowly regain color until the voided out terrain returned back to the center, and when it was all gone, the ultimate would end. It'd probably last for about 8 or 10 seconds. However, that's still not it, because while this ultimate is up, the Sentry would become the Void. In this state, all his light-based abilities would be replaced by darkness-based abilities. They'd also become more damaging, and of course, the Sentry himself would appear like the Void. He'd also gain the ability to fly during the ultimate. And that's it for the list. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I think my next list video like this will probably be a support video, but if you guys are interested, I have other videos on stuff like comics and some other things. Also, let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see me make a video on. Alright, that's all. Hope you have a good one. Peace out.